Hello, in this video we're going to talk about the Renaissance, with an emphasis on the Italian Renaissance and the new innovations in painting that happened during that time period. This time stretches between the late 1400s and the early 1600s, but most of what we're going to be talking about is between the year 1500 and the year 1600 CE. We're going to start by talking about an artist named Sandro Botticelli. Coming into the Renaissance, we're leaving the medieval period and coming into a place of cultural growth and rebuilding. So the medieval period is also often called the Dark Ages, where a lot of culture was destroyed, a lot of people were dying, there was a lot of loss of technology and information, and it was seen as the Dark Ages because you see the falling away of the Roman Empire and then nothing to replace it. So everyone was just kind of focused on survival for that probably about 1,000-year period. And then in the 1500s, we start to see a reemergence of culture and art and music and science in the Western world, in Europe. And we're going to start with a man named Botticelli, and this is his painting called The Birth of Venus. And there's something a little bit controversial about this painting. We can't really talk about the Renaissance without talking about the printing press and how the printing press really changed the world and changed the way information was spread in Europe. And so the printing press was invented by a man named Johann Gutenberg. It was invented in Western society by a man named Johann Gutenberg. And what he did is he would make individual letters that he could put together into a block and then press paper onto it and print the words onto that paper, which meant that they could really make books faster. They could make Bibles faster. They could make manuscripts took so long that they could replace that with something printed. So once you have the page, you could print it 100 or 1,000 times instead of handwriting each individual word on each page. So it really sped up how fast information got out and how many people had access to writing and reading. And so you started to see more literacy, not just within the church, but for everyone to be able to have access to literacy. And with this would come the Protestant Reformation. A man named Martin Luther was one of the first to really utilize the printing press and to make these lists of grievances against the Catholic Church, which led to the Protestant revolt. People leaving the Catholic Church, and then this warring between the Catholics and the Protestants, and then you have the Reformation, where the Catholic Church is making changes. So you have all of this stuff happening in culture and in society because people could read faster, and the Bible could be copied in people's native language, and it made a lot of changes to religion and to culture. So what does that have to do with this painting and Sandro Botticelli? So this is a large painting called The Birth of Venus, but the central figure isn't just Venus. Venus is a goddess. It's not just Venus. So the story is that Venus came out of the sea on an oyster like she's a pearl, so her skin is supposed to look pearl-like, and the westward wind is blowing her in, and this woman is coming and covering her up. But there are some elements of this that also have some Christian imagery in it. This image of Venus with her long neck looking like a pillar is a common depiction of the Virgin Mary. So he's kind of mixing different imagery together. He would make this combination of Christian imagery and Roman mythological imagery to create these new kinds of imagery. The problem was during the Catholic Reformation, this became very unacceptable. You can't mix mythology and religion. The Catholic Church would have people bring paintings in and sit down and analyze them and say, is this a Christian painting or is this a pagan painting? And if it wasn't deemed Christian enough, it would be destroyed or retitled or changed to make it Christian enough. Botticelli, he was one that earlier in his career made a lot of these paintings that were both mythological and Christian imagery together, and later in his life decided that he didn't think that that was good, that he thought that that was deceptive and could lead people astray, and so he destroyed a lot of his own artwork because he no longer agreed with the imagery. But this is one that did survive, The Birth of Venus. And I do want to talk about the way he was painting, the tools that he was using. Botticelli painted with egg tempera. Egg tempera is made with egg yolk. Sometimes it can be made with egg whites. And you add pigment to that egg yolk, and you can paint with it. So the media, the main medium in it, the binder, it's called the binder, which is like a glue, is egg. And the fat that's in egg, the lipids that are in egg, they're actually the same fat that is in oil paints. But egg is water-based. It dries very, very fast. So it makes it harder to paint with, harder to blend those colors together. So here's an example of one of Botticelli's paintings. This is The Boy in the Red Hat. And you can see that he's really getting a nice even skin tone. Those gradual changes of color are in there. This is not easy to do. This is layer after layer after layer after layer of very transparent, very thin paints. As an example, I do have here a little panel that's painted with egg tempera. This is one that I did just as an example years ago. And the way you start these egg tempera paintings is you start with these undertones. You can see right here in that shadow from the nose, there's some green in there. And you can see that green come through in certain places. So the first layer of paint in this is greenish blue. It's kind of a teal. And then slowly that color is put on top. The reason you use that green or the blue or purple, whatever the undertone of the skin that comes through is what you want to start with as your base layer. And then slowly, it is built up until you get the color that you're looking for, but still having some of that undertone showing through, like you do with your actual skin. But this does not blend. You cannot blend this together. It dries so fast. Maybe 20 seconds the paint is dry, and once it's dry, you can't move it around. It's waterproof. Even though it is water-based, it's waterproof. It will last thousands of years if it's not exposed to sunlight and water damage and everything. But this is very, very permanent and lasts a very long time. But it has to be done with those really slow, intentional, transparent layers. There's probably 40, 50 layers of paint in this that very slowly get you up to this color. So coming back to Botticelli's version, which is better than mine, it's much smoother. This is the way he worked and the way he painted. But we're going to compare that to a painting by another artist named Jan van Eyck. This is The Man in the Red Turban. So I want us to compare these two paintings, look at them side by side, and see what differences we see. They're both a portrait. They both have a red hat or hair covering. But this one seems much more realistic. It's very detailed. The folds in that fabric are so well painted. That red is so intense. The dark background really gives it a kind of a somber feel, while this one is lighter and more airy. One of the differences is that Botticelli is an Italian painter, and Italians tend to have more of these pastel, lighter colors, while Jan van Eyck, he was a Dutch painter. Even though he painted in Italy, he was Dutch. And with Dutch paintings, you tend to see a lot of darker brown tones and murkier backgrounds. But the main difference between these two painters is the tools that they used. The paint that they used is very different. Botticelli was using egg tempera. Jan van Eyck was using oil paint. Oil paint was invented around this time. Jan van Eyck is kind of seen as the inventor of oil paints. Even though he wasn't the only person working on it, there were a lot of artists that were trying to paint with oil. He just was really good at it. He was a good chemist. His chemistry was great. At the time, he was seen more as an alchemist. There's always been this connection between alchemy and art, that alchemy would eventually give way to chemistry, but alchemy was more like a magical practice of chemistry. So the way he did this transition, they realized egg had its limitations because it dries so fast. But oil takes a long time to dry, which means that you can paint with it and then you can blend it together. You can have two different colors, put them on the surface and blend them together, and makes it very forgiving. It makes it a lot easier to paint things like this in oil than it is in egg. But they had to find the right oils. You can't just take any oil and make paint out of it. The first oil that people would try, because it's the oil that they would be most familiar with and use the most, was olive oil. So if you're using olive oil for your skin, if you're using olive oil for food or for whatever reason, it would be natural to be like, we have this oil, let's make paint out of it. And they would make paint out of it and it would be great. The problem is that it doesn't dry. It's not a drying oil. It stays sticky forever. No one wants a sticky painting. So they tried doing this with olive oil. It didn't work. And so they were trying different oils and eventually found what oils work. And they're called drying oils. The main oil that's used is linseed oil, which is the same as flaxseed oil. So a lot of people use flaxseed oil for things like their hair and their skin. So just as an example, this is flaxseed oil here, and this is pretty old, so this is pretty thick. This will dry pretty quickly. So yeah, this is flaxseed oil. It smells like oil paint. Yeah, and this is what most oil paint is made out of. But as you can see, it's pretty yellow. This, if it is left in the dark, will get really dark. It'll turn yellow. So any of your white paints will start to yellow over time if you use linseed oil with them. So most white paints are made with a different oil. This is safflower oil. You can see that's really, really light. This isn't going to get dark like linseed oil, but it's not as stable. It doesn't dry quite the same. It doesn't get the thick film over the top that the other oil does. But any of these oils, they're perfectly safe. People have this ideal that oil paints are dangerous. Oil paints themselves are not dangerous. They're not toxic. You could drink this. It would be fine. You can cook with this. The other oil that I use here is this one. This is walnut oil. And this one still looks pretty yellow, but if you compare it to the linseed oil, you see it's not quite as yellow. But this one won't change color. This won't get any darker. This, the linseed oil, if it's left in a dark closet, will get very, very dark. And so over time, this one's going to yellow more. This isn't going to yellow near as much. So I use this for colors that I don't want to yellow, but they're not white, so it's not as big of a deal. So those are things like purple. Purples will turn kind of gray if they start to yellow. So purples, blues, certain reds that lean towards purple. While I'll just use linseed oil for any kind of yellows, oranges, reds, greens, things that if they get a little bit yellower, it doesn't matter. So this is what Jan van Eyck was experimenting with. What oils can he use to make paint? And he was so good at it. He was so good at it that he invented some of his own paints and colors. He was just a really good chemist. And this is one of his paintings that's very famous. It's called the Arnolfini Wedding. And he's showing off this green in the painting. This is supposed to be a wedding. It's hard to know, is she pregnant? Is she not pregnant? It's hard to know. She's holding her bustle up. It was a common practice to hold your dress up in the front like that, just to be able to walk. But it's hard to know that she might be pregnant. So what the circumstances around them getting married is, we don't exactly know. It could be that she got pregnant and so needs to get married fast. We have a dog in this painting. Dogs always represent loyalty and fidelity. Dogs tend to be pretty loyal to their owners. So when you have a dog in the painting, it's very common for wedding paintings to show that these two people are loyal and committed to one another. But he really wanted to show off this green. So there's a green called verdigris, and it is made from copper acetate. You put copper over an acid and let it sit, and it gets this green rust on it. And so what he realized is that it would turn brown over time, but he could dissolve it into varnish, what's called damar varnish, which is a pitch from a tree. He could dissolve it into that, and it would protect it from oxygen. It wouldn't oxidize. And so he could then take that, let it crystallize into rocks, grind those into a powder, mix that with oil, and he would have a green that would not turn brown over time. And this is called Van Eyck green. So this dress is named after the artist, Van Eyck green. Well, if you want to show this green that you invented, you want it to look as green as possible. Look at this fantastically green dress. This is not an easy color to make. I have made this color, and it takes a lot of time. So to show it off, he surrounds it with red. That red is going to make the green pop forward more. That red and yellow and blue that he puts around it makes this green stand way out. When you first look at this painting, the first thing you're drawn to is this green dress. And then you notice the man's ridiculous hat. It's so big, it seems so uncomfortable to wear. Originally, his tunic, what he's wearing, was probably a lot more purple, that like purple velvety texture, but it has faded and changed over time. Now, it's amazing how stable these paints are and how well he made these paints, that this painting has survived for such a long time. He painted this on wood, but the wood started to deteriorate. It started to rot. And after a while, people realized this painting is going to fall apart. They delaminated it, which means that they put it face down on a table and started shaving the wood off of the back. And they shaved that wood until they started to hit the paint. And as soon as they hit the paint, they stopped. So they completely removed this painting entirely from the wood that it was painted on. And then they sprayed glue on it and pressed a canvas onto it. And when they lifted it up, it transferred that painting to a canvas. So he painted this on wood, but now it's on a canvas. They completely removed the painting from the surface and glued it to a canvas. It's a crazy practice. It's amazing that they can even do it. And they don't do that now. But they were able to preserve this painting in that way. And look at it. I mean, it's still in such good shape. Now, I want to bring your attention to this chandelier that's between them. It's fancy, and it's very, very complicated. And it would be really hard to draw that and get it perfectly the first time. But something that they can do is they can X-ray paintings, and when they X-ray paintings, they can see the drawing underneath. And when they X-ray this, it doesn't look like he drew it and made mistakes, or he drew it out and then as he was painting made little changes. He drew it once perfect the first time, painted it once perfect the first time. No mistakes. People can't do that. People can't do that. Which tells us it's very likely that he was using a tool called a camera obscura. A camera obscura, an early camera obscura looked like this. It's a room with a hole in one wall, and light passes through that hole, and it projects an image on the opposite wall. In this case, he has a piece of fabric or paper stretched out that it projects that image onto that paper upside down and backwards, and he's able to trace it from the other side. This is the old school equivalent of an artist taking a projector, projecting an image on the wall, putting a canvas on the wall and tracing the image on there and then painting it. There are artists that do that. A lot of artists do that, actually. And they make some amazing paintings that way. But it is controversial because there's this idea that like artists should not be tracing an image from a projector. But we know that people have been doing this for over 500 years, more than 500 years. We don't know exactly how long this was a practice, but we know it was at least 500 years. And we're learning more and more that more artists were using this than we realized. Now, this was a secret. The artists did not want people to know that they were doing this. They wanted it to be magic. You stand there, I'm going to go in the other room for like 30 minutes. And when I come back, I have a perfect drawing of you. And that seems like magic. And they're like, how did you do that? And we're like, oh, the genies, the genius. I was overcome with the spirit of genius and was able to do it. Really, it's just there's a peephole in the wall and it was projecting the image in a dark room and I could trace it. So these started out as a whole room and then they got smaller and smaller with time, especially once lenses were created. You could really condense that image until they had tabletop versions of a camera obscura, which would have a mirror on the inside that you could put a piece of paper down on top of the sheet of glass, and then as light would pass through, it would reflect onto your paper and you could trace that image. This has been a common practice for 500 years. The next artist I want to talk about is Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci was a genius. He was not a very good chemist, but he was a genius. His sketchbooks are incredible. These are just pages from his sketchbooks, just some of his anatomy sketches. He's made some of the best anatomy sketches to ever be made. And if you look at how detailed these are, there's only one way he could make them, right? You could only make these drawings if you have seen a body dissected. There's no other way that you could find all of those muscles inside the shoulder, where they connect, how they connect, what that looks like, unless you dissected a human body. So that's what he did. Was it legal? No. Did people know he did it? Probably. They probably just looked away. But he was able to make these amazing sketches. So his work in anatomy and the understanding of human anatomy, sometimes his sketches still show up in sketchbooks because they're so good. He also, in these sketchbooks, he wrote everything backwards. Everything is a mirror image. So if you hold these in a mirror, then you can read them. If you knew Italian, you could read them. And his reasoning for doing that is he was left-handed. So if you're left-handed, you know that writing left to right, especially if with a pen, and he would have been using a dip pen that you dip in ink and then write, is really hard, and you end up with just ink covering your hand and you've just smudged everything you wrote. So he got away from this by just writing right to left and writing because he was left-handed, and that way he wouldn't be smudging the ink. So we do know that he was dissecting bodies. What he would do is when someone was scheduled to be executed, criminals, he would know what day they're going to be executed and where they're going to be buried. And then, so they would be executed, they would be buried. And that night, the same night they were buried, he would go, dig them up, take them home, dissect them, make drawings, and return them to the ground. Like I said, he was a good artist. He was a genius. He was a bad chemist. So this is a mural that he did. It's called The Last Supper. And it has a nice innovation in here, which is linear perspective. Linear perspective is something that starts to pop up during the Renaissance. And we didn't really see it much before the Renaissance, before the 1500s. These ideas of all of these lines coming to a point and giving depth in the image. And this is his painting of the Last Supper. So this is supposed to be Jesus, and they're all eating bread and drinking wine. And this person here, they have a bag of coins. That's Judas, who's going to betray Jesus. There's a lot of theories about who each of these people are and what their relationship to him is, and whether or not this person here is a woman. We don't know. If anyone's ever read the Da Vinci Code, I strongly suggest reading the Da Vinci Code. It's a fun book. A lot of the symbols and imagery in it, some of it is real, a lot of it is totally made up, not real. It's a good work of fantasy, but it does talk about this image and other Da Vinci artwork a lot, which is fun. But you can see this painting is falling apart. It's deteriorating. The paint is falling off of the wall. And that's because Da Vinci didn't quite understand the chemistry behind paint. He would mix oil and egg. So he was part of that transition from egg tempera to oil paint. And instead of completely abandoning egg and just making paint with oil, he would still make his egg tempera, but then add some oil to it to make it smoother, to make it blend better. The problem is oil and water don't mix. You can't mix oil and water. And when you do, it becomes very unstable and the paint just flakes off of the wall. And there's a certain order that you have to paint in. It's more than what you need to know just for an art history reason, but there's kind of this order of like you can have ink on the bottom, watercolor on top of that, egg tempera on top of that, acrylic paint on top of that, oil paint on top of that. And oil paint always has to be on the top. And as long as you go in that order, it will be stable. But if you paint oil paint and then egg tempera on top of it, the egg tempera is going to fall off. And that's just kind of the science of it. It has to do with how much fat there is, and the fat has to be on the top or it dries too slowly and you get a film on the top that falls off. But anyway, he didn't understand, because this was a new technology, he didn't understand the drying rates and how it affected the paint. And so immediately after he painted it, this paint started to fall off of the wall. And so it's been restored time and time again. They recently stripped it down to the original painting, and there's not much of the original painting left. And realized that the painting that we've been seeing for centuries is mostly where they've painted it back in after the original paint has fallen off. Now, another artist during the Renaissance is Raphael. Raphael was the best artist for using linear perspective. So when you think of linear perspective, think about Raphael. He didn't invent it, but he did master it. So when you see all of these lines coming to right here, all of these lines coming to right here, this archway here is painted on, and all of the lines in that coming to right here, all of the lines on the floor coming to the same place. It's all very structured and gives you that sense of depth that this goes way back. This is called the School of Athens, and it's a painting of the original school in Athens, Greece. School meaning just like a group of philosophers, and it doesn't mean just like one building. It's just like the entire culture surrounding learning in Athens. So the people that he's painting in this are not people that were alive during the Renaissance. These are classical figures. These are people from 500 BCE, not 1500 CE. So we have in the background, we have Plato and Aristotle. Plato is pointing up. He's like the original philosopher, saying if you want to find truth, look up, look up. And juxtaposed against him is Aristotle, who has his arm out, that is saying if you want to find truth, look out. Look at the world around you, the observable world. This is kind of that early beginnings of that conflict of religion as a source of truth versus science and observation as a source of truth, but them kind of walking together with the idea that they're observing the same truth, they're finding the same truth, but approaching it from two different directions. And interestingly, this painting is in the study, in the office of the Pope. This is in the Vatican. So when the Pope sits down at his desk to do his work for the day, whatever that is, this is what is in front of him. This is what he sees. A few of the other people that are in this painting, we have over here holding a map of the stars is Copernicus. We have a person here that's very important, this portrait right there. That is a self-portrait. That's Raphael himself. And one other person that I want to point out is Hypatia. Hypatia is this woman right here. Now, when Raphael proposed to include Hypatia in this painting, Hypatia was a mathematician in Egypt, one of the early mathematicians and astronomer, really a great innovator in mathematics. When he proposed to the cardinals, to the Catholic Church, including Hypatia in this painting, they said no. They said, no, you cannot put a woman in this painting. Only men. So he kind of thought about it, like, what could he do to include Hypatia? So what he did is he went out and found a model to be Hypatia, to sit as the portrait of Hypatia, and the model was a boy. The person that he found as his model was the Pope's nephew. And so then he just painted Hypatia in there, but the portrait is the Pope's nephew. And he knew that the cardinals wouldn't say, oh, you can't include her in there, because he knew that the cardinals weren't going to complain to the Pope and say that the Pope's nephew was a girl. So that was his way of getting Hypatia into this painting. Now here in the front we have a figure that seems a little bit out of place. You can see this person right here. What they are leaning against doesn't really fit. It doesn't line up with all of the other lines going here. It almost looks like it goes into the steps there because he's sitting on a step and then this thing is there. It's kind of a confusing figure there. It doesn't quite fit. And that figure was actually added to the painting kind of as an afterthought. So while Raphael was working on this painting, there was another artist in the same building making a different painting. So the story is, this is a story, it's hard to know what the truth of it is, but the story is that Raphael, when he was working on this, took a break, walked down the hall into a different room, and when he walked into that room, he saw Michelangelo painting this, the Sistine Chapel. And when he saw it, he thought to himself, this person is so significant. This person is amazing. This person deserves to be included in my painting of innovators and philosophers and scientists and groundbreaking people. And so he added Michelangelo to this painting. So this is the one person in this painting that is a contemporary, was alive during the Renaissance. And Michelangelo was painting this. And the irony of Michelangelo painting this is that he was not a painter. This is the extent of Michelangelo's paintings. He doesn't have a lot of paintings that exist because he was a sculptor. So again, the story about how Michelangelo got this job to paint the Sistine Chapel, it's a huge job, is that he was in an ongoing feud, a fight with painters in Rome and in Florence. He lived in Florence. And the argument they were always having is who is a better artist? Who understands art better? Is it sculptors or painters? And sculptors would say, oh, we're the sculptors. We have to understand things in 3 dimensions. We have to understand the way things look from different angles. We aren't making one thing. As you walk around it, it looks like a totally different thing. And so we have to understand that 3-dimensional form and how it moves through a space. So we're better artists. The painters would then say, no, we're the better artists. We have to create the illusion of 3 dimensions, the illusion of form, by understanding how things move as they go back and layering things up. We have to understand color and color balance and how to mix color. We're the greater artists. So there was this ongoing feud. And when the Vatican was looking for someone to paint this chapel, they were asking all of the normal artists that normally would do this kind of work, and everyone was busy. They all had other projects going on. So someone said, hey, why don't you ask Michelangelo? He keeps saying he's the greatest artist of all time. Why don't you ask him if he could do it? As a joke. And then the Catholic Church was like, all right, we'll ask him. They asked Michelangelo, and he said, sure, I'll paint it. And everyone kind of laughed, like, you're a sculptor. You've never painted anything. How are you going to paint the Sistine Chapel? And then he did this. And it took him years and years and years. He built scaffolding so that he could be on the ceiling to paint it. And this is painted with fresco. And fresco is very, very hard. The way fresco works is you take plaster, a white plaster, and you put it on the wall. And while it is still wet, you take pigment, which is just powdered color, and water. And that's it. And you paint it on the wet plaster. And it becomes a part of that plaster, and when the plaster dries, you're actually coloring the plaster. This is essentially like taking concrete and adding coloring the concrete while it's wet, and when it dries, it becomes a part of that wall. And so that's what this is. So you could only do so much in a day. The way he would work on this is he would have a team working at night he would say, I want you to plaster this section of wall for me to paint tomorrow. They would put the plaster on. He would wake up in the morning and just start painting. From the time he woke up to when he went to bed, he would be painting that section of plaster, because you have about 12 to 20 hours to do the whole painting before it dries, before it cures. And once it cures, it's done. You can't work on it anymore. And the only way to fix a mistake is to chip it off and do it again. And so he would get done, and he would say, okay, we're doing this part tomorrow. His team would come in, they would plaster that. He would come the next day and paint that section. If he didn't like what he did, he would say, tear that off. We're going to do it again. And that's how he worked on this for years. But again, his main job, what he was known for, was sculpture. This is the David by Michelangelo. And this is a very famous sculpture. If you've seen any of his work, this is one that you've probably seen. And one of the things that we tend to not understand just looking at images of this is that it's very big. This is like it's more than 13 feet tall. This is a very large statue. So a 6 foot tall man, their head would be about at the height of his hand if they were standing next to him. That's how tall this statue is. And he didn't get this stone as a unstarted block. This sculpture was already started when he got it. A different artist abandoned the project, and he got the stone and he finished it. But it's an amazing work, and it does look very similar to the spear bearer, the spear bearer by Polykleitos, the Doryphoros. It's that same pose. He has the one hand up. He has all of his weight on one leg. His hips are tilted. You can tell that Michelangelo was looking at that classical artwork, and that's something that we'll see in the Renaissance over and over again, is that they're looking at that classical period as a period of enlightenment, a period of education. That's what Raphael was looking at with the School of Athens. That's what Michelangelo is looking at here. And with that becomes a culture of what's called humanism. So the Renaissance is often associated with humanism, which is a antithesis, an opposite of theism. So when we looked at like Byzantine and medieval art, it's all focused around spirituality and around God and religion, while in the Renaissance you have this shift to artwork being about mankind, humanhood. And instead of elevating the gods or elevating God, we are elevating humanity, which is called humanism, which would give birth to individualism in Western society. So this sculpture, it's amazingly done. The anatomy is incredibly accurate. His head is a little bit large. His hands and feet and head are large, and he has that forehead that protrudes out. It's very similar to what we saw with the colossal statue of Emperor Constantine, where that face kind of tilts forward. That's because this was initially sculpted to go on the top of a building. This is supposed to be on the roof, and you're supposed to be down in the square looking up at it. So if you're looking at this from way, way, way below, you need to have that forehead come forward so that you can even see the face, those big hands, big feet, so that you can see them from the ground. But after it was completed, the person that hired him to do it said, there's no way I'm going to stick this on the top of a roof for birds to poop on it and no one ever to see it or notice it. So he stuck it down in the center of the square for everyone to look at. Now, it's important to note that at the time, the David was a very popular symbol for rebellion, a symbol for standing up to an oppressor. So it comes from this story of David standing up to Goliath, who was a giant, and not fearing him, supposed to be a 17-year-old fighting a grown man that's like 10 feet tall. And so this became a symbol for oppressed people standing up to the elite, wealthy, affluent people of society. And where Michelangelo lived, that upper crust of society was one family in particular that owned all of the banking institutions and owned a lot of the businesses in Florence, and that was the Medici family. The Medici family did not like this sculpture. They knew that it was a symbol, that people saw this as a representation and of the idea of standing up to that family and the wealth of that family and pushing back against them. They actually hired kids to throw rocks at this sculpture to try to damage it. They did not like it. They did not like Michelangelo. I also want to point out that Michelangelo was looking at Greek sculpture and not Hebrew tradition when he made this. So David, this person of David, this king, is supposed to be a 17-year-old Hebrew boy and is supposed to be, according to tradition, circumcised. And in this sculpture, he's not. He is Greek. He is not a Hebrew man, and he also does not look 17. So there's definitely some liberties that Michelangelo took. He was idealizing this and looking back at some of those images of Apollo. So he's doing some of what Botticelli was trying to get away from. He was taking this historical figure and making him look more godlike, specifically looking at statues of Apollo. This is another one of his very famous sculptures. This is called the Pietà. And this is a sculpture of the Virgin Mary holding her son, Jesus, after he had come down from the cross, after he has died. And this sculpture is inside St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And it's an amazing sculpture. There's places that the marble is carved so thin that you can see candlelight through it. And marble is very soft. It chips easily. It's hard to get it carved that precisely and that delicately. This sculpture was broken once. His toe right here on the end was broken off. Someone came in to the church and hit it with a hammer and broke that toe off, so it did have to be reattached. But one of the things I want you to think about when you look at this is how tall Mary would be if she stood up. She's much taller than Jesus here. And we have to understand, like, Mary, and according to tradition, Mary would have become pregnant with her son when she was a teenager. And he would have been 36 when he was killed. So she would be in her 50s, early 50s. She does not look like she is in her early 50s. She looks more like she's 17. She looks very young. And if she stood up, she seems like she'd be 8-9 feet tall. If he's a grown man, she would be very, very tall. She's just very big. And so he is taking some liberties here. He is making her perpetually young. Like, she does not age, and she is a giant. And giving her stature, giving her that presence to make her bigger than she is and more significant, more. And it does go back to that Roman idea of how do you want her to be seen, not how did she look, and wanting her to always be seen as young, always be seen as a virgin, always be seen as a teenager, even as a grown woman. And for her to have a presence, for her to seem very elevated and powerful, and to do that, making her very large. Michelangelo is where the term Renaissance man comes from. If you've ever heard someone say, oh, it's a Renaissance man or a Renaissance person, I've never heard anyone say Renaissance person. It's kind of sexist. Michelangelo excelled at everything that he did. He was the best sculptor. He was the best painter. He invented an entire new genre of painting called Mannerism, based on the paintings he did on the Sistine Chapel. When they had them restored, they realized that the colors weren't what they thought they were initially, and that he might have actually started an entire art movement just by painting that ceiling. And then he was also an architect. He grew up in Florence, and in Florence there is a building with a really nice dome called the Duomo, and that is thought to maybe be an inspiration for Michelangelo for this. This is St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. St. Peter's Basilica, when it was being built, was just a nightmare. They had several architects come and make drawings, especially drawings of this central dome, this giant dome in the middle. And then they would abandon the project. The builders wouldn't work on it. It wouldn't work. They would get a new architect. They'd make new drawings. And then at one point they decided, oh, let's just forget the central dome. It's too big. It can't be done. Let's ignore it. But they kept having architect after architect after architect fail when trying to make this building. And eventually they asked Michelangelo, and he's like, yeah, I'll make some drawings for you. I'll help you finish this building. And so Michelangelo designed the central dome of St. Peter's Basilica, which is a massive, massive dome, huge undertaking. And so he ended up being one of the greatest architects of the Renaissance as well. And you can see the architecture here. He's looking back at that Greek and Roman architecture that we saw at the Pantheon with its giant dome. They didn't have cement or concrete to work on it here, but they were able to build it out of stone and brick. I want to talk about one artist from the Northern Renaissance, which is not in Italy. This is a German artist. His name is Albrecht Dürer. And Albrecht Dürer was an incredible painter. Again, when we're looking at Northern artists and Dutch artists, they have these dark tones, these darker backgrounds, these browns. But Albrecht Dürer, he was the son of a watchmaker, so he did a lot with metalwork. He did a lot with printing and books, and he obviously did some amazing painting work. And you can see here he's trying to show off some of his skill. He's able to paint skin tones. He can paint hair. He was very proud of his hair. And there's actually a place where they have a lock of his hair that still exists. And you can tell he took very good care of his hair. And he wants you to see that, like, he has nice hair. He can paint this fur texture. He has, like, his fingers touching, like, going into that fur. So you can kind of think about that textile touch of it. And he was just an incredible painter. One of the things about this image that is unique is that it wasn't typical at the time to paint a portrait of yourself looking straight at the viewer. Normally, a self-portrait or a portrait of a person would be a three-quarters view, where they're looking to the side, one side or the other. This view, this pose, was reserved for images of Jesus. Like, if you think about the Pantocrator and what it looks like, and compare that to this, they look so similar. He painted himself as Jesus, in the pose of Jesus, like a savior. And he was very bold in doing that. And he also had this AD was his monogram. He was one of the first artists to start signing artwork. He really wanted you to know who made this and who he was. And this was made in the year 1500. So it says 1500 AD. which is 1500 Anno Domini, which is the year of the Lord, 1500, but it's also AD Albrecht Dürer. But he was really famous for his woodcuts. So woodcuts are a stamp that you make by carving into wood. To make a stamp, you put ink on the stamp, and then you put it in a press and put paper on it and press it down, and it transfers that image. And this is one of his prints. This is his most famous print. That is a woodcut, a wood engraving. So he has carved this into wood. This is really hard to do. It takes very, very time consuming. And this is the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. He made a whole book about the end of the world. So in the year 1500, people thought that the world was going to end that year. This is very common. Every 500 years or so, people think the world is going to end. I remember the year 2000. I know a lot of students today don't remember the year 2000, but I remember the year 2000 that everyone panicked. Everyone was like, oh no, the world's going to end. Computers don't know how to handle the date changing to the year 2000. All the computers are going to fail. Financial institutions are going to collapse. The world is going to come to an end, and everyone started hoarding canned foods and got rain barrels to collect water, because who knows if we're going to have water, because it's the year 2000. I remember that happening, and that's recent history. The same thing happened in the year 1500. People were like, oh, 1500, that's a significant year. Jesus is going to come back. The end of the world is coming. The apocalypse is coming. Society is going to collapse. Everything's going to be destroyed. And so he made this book of these like end of the world scenes, and it was very popular. A lot of people bought it, and it's where he got his notoriety from. So he has here the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. This is the end of the world. You have an angel bringing in the end of the world. And something I do want to point out down here, we talked earlier about this like conflict between the Catholic Church and Protestants that was going on at the time, especially where Dürer was, especially in Germany. And down here we have this devil, demon, lion, dragon here devouring the Pope. That's the Pope. A pretty clear message that Albrecht Dürer was not a big fan of the Catholic Church. He was not hiding that in this image. Outside of Europe, I want to talk about what was happening in Japan. So Japanese art went in a very different direction than what happened in Europe. And non-Western art was going in a totally different direction. And around this time, Japan decided to shut down trade with the West. Christianity was growing, and Western culture was spreading in the West very fast. And when that happened, Japan decided to become completely isolationist. They created a ban on trade with the West. So there was no trading of artwork or textiles or anything between Japan and Europe. And this lasted for quite a long time, probably about 500 years, that there was no contact between these cultures. So Japanese art developed in its own direction. It was a very traditional form of art, and it didn't go in this direction of realism that was happening in Europe and in the West. In the West, everyone's like, we're going to copy real life as perfectly as we can to make these really real looking images. And in Japan, they were going in the direction of simplicity and elegance. And so these are some ink drawings. This is an ink drawing by an artist named Sesshu Toyo. And you can see there's a lot of information here, but it's very simple. You can see that there's these mountains in the background. There's kind of a house down here in the foreground at the bottom, and a hill in the middle with some trees and wildlife on it, that you get this mystical sense of like there's a fog going back, that you just see the mountaintops coming out of the top. And so this is a different way of looking at perspective. We don't have lines going back. We don't have those layers of things covering up other things so that we know what's behind them. In perspective in Japanese art, especially in woodcuts and in prints and in ink drawings like this, you have these like layers going up, where the higher it is on the page, the farther away it is. And the lower it is on the page, the closer it is to you. And this kind of perspective is really common in places that are mountainous. Places with lots of mountains, you don't tend to see as much perspective drawing emerging. So this is this is also an ink drawing by Sesshu Toyo. And this gives you an idea of what the landscape in Japan looks like and why you're not going to see these long straight lines and seeing how those lines converge on one point and create a linear perspective. No, you see these mountains upon mountains upon mountains, and you know something's far away because of how high it is, not because of how it goes behind. So you can see that the houses up here are the same size as the houses down here. That distance isn't because, realistically, if it's that far away, it would be much, much, much smaller. Maybe you wouldn't even be able to see it. But he's giving you that distance based on how high it is on the page, and everything down here is very close to you. But you can see that these mountains and these mountains, the size of them is the same in this image. It's just a very different way of doing perspective. And these cultures were very, very separate. Most of history, we see lots of communication and trade and exchange of ideas between Egypt and Greece and Rome and England and India and China. We see all of this trade and all of this knowledge being exchanged. But we have this period of time that all of that exchange is completely cut off in Japan, which allowed Japanese artwork and culture to kind of develop in its own direction. Also happening at the same time as the Renaissance in Europe, we have these sculptures from Nigeria. These are from a group called the Ife or Yoruba people, and they're amazing. This is a terracotta sculpture, it's clay, and the realism in these is so incredible. It's very nicely done. And they have these in clay, and they also have them in bronze. And these were happening completely separate from Europe. This is in sub-Saharan Africa. And these are some really great examples that have survived. Most places in sub-Saharan Africa, artwork like this has been lost. If there was artwork like this, it's hard for us to know. It all has to do with colonization and what happened when different regions were colonized. If the cultural artifacts and cultural artwork was collected and stolen, or if it was destroyed. And in a lot of places, it was destroyed. So my wife and I, we lived in Rwanda for a couple of years and learning about Rwandan tradition and how much was lost just because when they were colonized by the Belgians destroyed everything. They didn't collect it and steal it, they destroyed it. And they also wouldn't allow people to tell their stories and wouldn't allow people to sing their songs or act out their plays or have social gatherings of any kind. And it means that now people are trying to revive their culture, from their pre-colonial culture, and find those stories that were lost. And it's really sad. In Nigeria, the way they were colonized was a little bit different, where they were allowed to practice their cultural activities, and they were allowed to continue their artwork, and things like this weren't destroyed. They were stolen. A lot of these are in the British Museum in England. But it's nice that they exist. It would be nice if they would go back to Nigeria, but they do exist still, which is good. And I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in these. If I look at this hair, the hairstyle that she has there, it looks very similar to this hairstyle. So these are some images of Rwandan men from the 1920s. And this hairstyle is called amasunzu. And that's what we're seeing represented here, is that very similar traditional sub-Saharan African hairstyle of amasunzu. And amasunzu has made a comeback in Rwanda in the last 5 or 10 years. and it's really cool to see it come back, and you can get some really, really interesting, really cool hair forms. And these are the bronze sculptures, and they're so well done. They're very realistic, and bronze is hard. The way these were made is that these would be sculpted first in wax. They would be made out of beeswax, and then they would cover that beeswax in clay or plaster, and then heat it up over a fire, and all of that wax would melt out and leave a hole and leave the plaster or the clay, and then they could take bronze and pour it into that hole, and it would make these bronze casted faces. And these were painted. You can still see some of the pigment on the headdress here of the man in the middle. And their faces were painted. Everything was painted. These looked very realistic when they were first done. A lot of that paint has worn off over the years. They're 500 years old. And the body would have been made out of something else. A lot of them had hair that attached to the back. And on this one, you can see these holes right here. Those holes were there so that hair could be attached to some little sticks that could be pushed into those holes. So he had a beard when it was sculpted. But all of that has been lost with time. And then they have all of these lines on their face, all of these concentric lines. And where that comes from is a status symbol, that these are important people. These are kings, queens, and their status is shown by markings that they would have on their face. So this is scarification that was very common and is practiced to some degree today, not usually to this extent, but there is still scarification that's practiced in sub-Saharan Africa and specifically with the Yoruban people, mostly in Nigeria. And so all of these markings, the more that you would have and the more intricate they are, the higher your status would be. So seeing these, having so many so close together, these are very important people. And there isn't really any record that the Ife were in communication with what was happening in Europe. This is a completely separate movement. This is completely separate art tradition, but it is during that same Renaissance period. These aren't technically a part of the Renaissance because the word Renaissance means rebirth or renew. And so in Europe, that meant they were looking back at classical Greek and Roman art and bringing it back into their culture and renewing that art, a rebirth of Western tradition in art. So when you use the term Renaissance, these aren't going to be included because they are not part of that movement. But I've also just never seen these in a textbook, and I really want to show them to you because they're great. That concludes my video on the Renaissance. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.